Oh, timer started already. Okay. So as as Aaron mentioned, it's been a beat since the last St. Lawrence River presentation here at LOC. You can fact check me because my brain doesn't always work memory wise here, but I think I actually gave the last presentation 10 years ago. So this is kind of a neat experience. Come full circle. Um, I have about 2 minutes to go through each of those, well, each year for those 10 years. So I will do my best. There's been a lot of work happening down the St. Lawrence, and I think what we've seen through all of these presentations today is the level of collaboration across the basin is pretty amazing, and it continues down the St. Lawrence River. So co-authors Les, Alex, they're the lead bios for a lot of this assessment. Excuse me. And Colin and Jana helping out to provide a lot of this information. I can look at this easy. So for the overview, I just wanted to cover our fisheries assessment program throughout the St. Lawrence River. It's a binational program. We will get into that, highlighting some of the collaborations and partnerships that have really grown in the last 10 years, arguably the last 5 years for some. And there's a breadth of species I could talk about, but we decided to focus on three, being smallmouth bass, walleye, and northern pike. And then I'll just hit a bit of a summary. So orientation, hopefully people are familiar with the St. Lawrence River. This isn't necessarily for the people in the room. For those that can't see this, that are hopefully watching this online, the thousands of views I'll get. Where the gillnet is down in the bottom corner, that is where Lake Ontario is located. So this is the continuation. This is Wolf Island, the little point that's jutting out. And Kingston is right in behind sort of that gillnet there. So this is the Thousand Island area, jointly New York DEC and Ontario net this location throughout from Kingston essentially down to Brockville. This is done by DEC annually in July, and it's been happening since 1977. They set 32 gillnets there. They're bottom set gillnets from 1.5 inches up to 6 inches. Ontario sets the exact same gear in the exact same way in the Ontario waters. So we have 25 gillnet sites that occur from Kingston down the river. This was biennially for us, which is every other year, from 1989 up to 2019, and then in 2019 we made some programmatic shifts so that we can net these locations annually. So we're now moving downstream, so towards Quebec. This is Lake St. Lawrence. This is, it was at a time netted by both Ontario and DEC. It rotated each year. Ontario 1 year would net Lake St. Lawrence in American and Canadian waters, and then DEC would do the same. In 1996, DEC took the lead for this project, setting 32 gillnets in Ontario and New York waters, splitting them equally to do the assessment there. It's the same gillnets that were used in that Thousand Island section. Okay, so consistency throughout. At the very end here, again, there's a line for people that may be watching online on the far right. That's the Moses Saunders Dam. That's the next slide, a little bit different of a graph. This is now Lake St. Francis. The green location, so that map is the entirety of Lake St. Francis. The green location is where historically Ontario netted. And so through time, again, this is new as of 10 years ago presentation, there's been a lot of conversations. If we want to take a positive spin to COVID, it forced a lot of us into the virtual world, and that allowed us to reach out to partners much more easily and make these connections. It really started a dialogue between different agencies and different communities, and increased our partnerships. So now, excuse me, Lake St. Francis, we're looking at it in a more holistic way. So we still have our traditional locations with working through partnerships with Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. We now have netting in this area that goes closer to the Moses Saunders Dam and around the Akwesasne community. And we've had quite a bit of coordination with the province of Quebec. They net Lake St. Francis on a different frequency, but ultimately in 2022, we were able to coordinate our netting to net essentially the entirety of Lake St. Francis in a consistent way with consistent gear to get an understanding of what that population, those fish populations are doing across that basin. All right, Got a lot of flack for these images, but just bear with me. So, three species. We're going to focus on smallmouth bass. Again, Sarah beach covered in the eastern basin section some smallmouth bass. She alluded that I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to cover it very coarsely. One of the things that has been a common theme, though, is the fishery in the eastern basin as well as the St. Lawrence River. So these little snippets, in 2019, the St. Lawrence River is named the best bass fishery in the nation. More recently, St. Lawrence River named the best bass lake by Bassmaster Magazine. And again, for those that are more tech savvy and use YouTube, if you search any of this stuff up, you're inundated with amazing catches, nothing I'll be able to achieve, but a really cool fishery that's happening out there and very prominent. So Sarah mentioned the tournament fishery is also very prominent throughout the Bay of Quinte, Eastern Basin, down the St. Lawrence River. And absolutely, one new thing that has come out more recently in 2025, New York now has a black bass fishing tournament permit. So to run one of these tournaments in New York, you go through this permitting process. So this has been really cool. It gives a neat insight on that industry. And from a fisheries assessment side of things, it's kind of cool to see the number of tournaments that are occurring in these different areas and what impact that may or may not have on the fishery. But in addition to that, it gives us a bit of a glimpse at economic contributions of these tournaments to these local areas where it's likely very important to their local economies. So what I thought was kind of cool was in 2025, this is broken down into St. Lawrence River only, and then tournaments that are a combination of St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario, and then also just Lake Ontario only tournaments. And in 2025, there were 68 tournaments. Now the season, for those of you that may not know, hasn't opened yet, but we already have 71 tournaments that have applied or registered through this process. So it's going to be another good year for tournaments in the Eastern Basin and St. Lawrence River. And overall, the average, these aren't exact numbers, I just kind of gave the average. We have 90% central weigh-ins, so that's those big events I go to or used to go to with my kids when they were still interested in it. But to hold up the big fish, you get to see the weigh-ins, you get to see all the fancy boats, and then there's also, the 10% of these tournaments are the catch, weigh, release tournaments. Right, so for some orientation, we're talking a lot about how great the fishery is. Let's see some data. As a biologist, you always like to have graphs, so here we go. This is just to orient where we're getting our catches. So this is from our gill netting program that I talked about before. And we talked about the tournaments, we talked about the great fishery that's there. And what we've been seeing in some of these locations is increases in smallmouth bass abundances. There's increases there, it's stable in these other locations. That's promising for that fishery and that's promising for that population. Another thing that we want to consider is the condition of those fish. And so from that information, we're also taking biological measurements, we're aging the fish. In this case, again, the intention is not to read it, it's just to get the gist. So I'm adding in some arrows to help people. But the idea here is we want to see at age 5, are fish getting bigger or smaller through time? And what we have been seeing that's consistent throughout the St. Lawrence River is an increase in condition. So in New York waters, they have a 12-inch minimum for smallmouth. And what's kind of cool is prior to that red line, they weren't hitting 12 inches until they were about 6 years old. After that red line, and now they're hitting 12 inches at 4 years old. So their growth has increased dramatically. I already gave away the punchline because this is already loaded, but that red line represents when round gobies came into the system. So as round gobies became more abundant, smallmouth bass started incorporating them into their diet opportunistically, and that was accelerating their growth. So guys, we're talking about this amazing fishery. We're seeing increases in abundance or stability, and we're seeing increases in condition and growth for the species, which is pretty neat. So the last point I wanted to make on smallmouth bass is both St. Lawrence River and Eastern Lake Ontario for New York are looking into smallmouth bass fisheries management plans. So this is sort of under development and something to look forward to moving forward. Okay. This is a walleye, despite what people have told me. So next we'll talk about walleye. I'll fix the picture for next year's. Anyway, so Jess gave a great talk on the walleye workshop. There's a lot of information in there for sure. So knowing that she was going to give that amazing talk, I am just taking little snippets, and I will defer people back to that. If you didn't get to see it, it will get posted presumably, and you can review some of that material. But again, it speaks to that collaboration and the importance of communication and understanding the biology behind these species and the linkages that are there. So back to the map for orientation, and again, throwing some graphs up there. Here are the walleye populations. This is the same information that just presented, just a little bit blown up, just specific to the St. Lawrence River. So again, for walleye, we're seeing increases in a lot of locations down the St. Lawrence River and stability in Lake St. Lawrence specifically. Now, what's interesting, and as Jess pointed out, there's a lot of work that's going on around walleye. The agencies are really focused on habitat. So I'm not going to talk too much about acoustic telemetry just for the sake of time. If we want to have some questions about it, we can. But on the habitat point, and I know Steve Lepan mentioned a couple of these points previously, there has been work that's ongoing. So Oswegatchie River in 1995 had some spawning beds created. Brandy Brook, I'm going to talk about in a second. Kent's Creek, which was mentioned earlier today. Little Sucker Brook, Black River, and Hoople Creek, which I'll also talk about. I forgot the date on here, but in Hoople Creek in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a bunch of work done through local angling community as well as MNR to recreate some and improve some spawning habitat in Hoople Creek. And then it's just a bit of an update for 2024. So there's been a lot of focus on habitat. We're seeing stability in those populations or increases in a lot of those locations. And so we're seeing a lot of success stories here. Now to focus on Brandy Brook, again, this is DEC biologist Mike Morgan is leading this. This was identified in Moses Saunders' FERC relicensing settlement through NIPA. And in 2007, these spawning beds were constructed. So the red location was a historic spawning bed, and then downstream and upstream of that historic spawning bed were two new constructed pieces. If you can see that, it is green and blue. For those that are colorblind, I will work on adjusting that for the future. Now, Mike monitors these locations for the condition of that habitat, and it's monitored annually. He also set drift nets to catch emerging fish. So if there was successful spawning, those fish would subsequently emerge and some would float into his nets, and he's tracking successful reproduction. And he was tracking that year after year up to 2017 when he decided, hey, we're having a lot of success here. I'm going to move this to a 5-year frequency. So now he nets every 5 years. He's still tracking successful reproduction in this location. And this is reported, or the monitoring activities are reported annually to the Technical Advisory Board. So Hoople Creek, as I mentioned, there was some habitat work that happened in the late 80s, early 90s. Since that time, there have been a few adjustments, but for the most part, it's been utilized by walleye. And more recently, we've heard from local angling groups in the community that they weren't seeing walleye come back to the spawning beds, and they were trying to understand what was going on there. So we did some recon work, and we're working with partnership through Mohawk Council of Akwesasne as well as OPG. And through that, we found that, hey, there's some beaver dams that are downstream, and those beaver dams are blocking the walleye from actually reaching the spawning beds. So through that partnership, we removed the beaver dams, community members assisted in removing the beavers, and now we've increased that connectivity back to that historic spawning bed. That was all done in 2024. We did hear that walleye were coming back in 2025, and we're expecting to see sort of increased returns as we go through. So pretty exciting. There's some work happening moving forward, and communication with Mike Morgan, who I mentioned before. He's given us a lot of tips on critical information that would help us record habitat condition here and compare it to what he's seen on Brandy Brook, so we can sort of feed off of each other on the successes. Okay, that's it for walleye for now. Northern pike. This is part of a presentation I gave a few years ago at a river symposium out of Cornwall. And at the time, this was highlighting that new relationship with Quebec, where we were combining our data sets. And in 2022, we did the netting of the entirety of Lake St. Francis, essentially. And what was, I guess, good was that we had a lot of consistency, which wasn't great. Was the consistency was sort of a pretty significant downward trend in northern pike in Lake St. Francis. So if you can't see down here, there's blue and black. The blue is Quebec. The black are our nets, relatively consistent. Right here, it looks like one big dot. That's because each of the agencies, our netting was exactly on top of each other. So consistency through time. Pike populations were going down in our index netting. So we also took that information and just sort of, I coarsely broke it down into large pike and small pike. So this is that same information just broken down into large and small. So you still see that same decline. We're not seeing very many small pike in our index anymore. And when we looked at Quebec's information, they had the same pattern. So one of our partners with Quebec, Simone, he decided, well, I'm going to look back in time. And in 2004 and 2014, we both netted Lake St. Francis, but it wasn't coordinated. In 2022, it was coordinated. The point of this, though, was those colored dots represent where we were catching pike. And in 10 years' time, there were very few colored dots. And then now we're in 2022, well, 2026, but in this 2022, and you can see there's a lot of area of coverage here where we're not catching pike anymore. So again, that was Lake St. Francis. Now we're talking about the St. Lawrence River in its entirety. And so we're putting our index netting up here between New York and Ontario. And if you can't see it, I went with black and white for contrast. It was easy for everyone in the room. But here's what's happening. We have declines in northern pike throughout the St. Lawrence River. To different degrees in different locations, but overall declines. Now, again, as I mentioned, Quebec and Ontario, we're sharing our data. We're trying to get a better understanding of what's happening across the landscape. And so working with DEC, Quebec, and Ontario, combining our data sets, we're seeing further downstream. So beyond that red little spot is where our Ontario netting stops. And into Quebec waters, we're still seeing declines in northern pike throughout the St. Lawrence River. Okay, so while slightly depressing, we're going to move on to some positive pieces around the sockets. We have an Asakid working group. They were formed, a muskellunge group was formed in the 1980s. It's since become an Asakid working group in 1999. This really rallied experts in the field to come together. It was specifically VHS, I think, that drove this, or viral hemorrhagic septicemia. No one corrected me, so I think that's good. And that really drove it. So we were seeing muskie kind of wash up on shores. It was affecting the Asakid community. And so this group of experts was getting together to get a better handle on how they could mitigate some of these pieces. So more recently, the group has got back together and they're looking at these various mechanisms around the Asakid populations. There's a lot of notes on there. I'll just wing it. All right, so the monitoring is showing continued challenges. As you clearly saw, it's gone down. We're not seeing things go up right now. Active management is continuing. There's a lot of work around creating channelization so that there's access to habitat, creating spawning pools to promote this reproduction. We, as I mentioned, are not seeing a lot of young of year Asakids in our surveys, and so we know that that is a pinch point, and there's a lot of work gone into trying to sort out how to best resolve that. Steve is here. There's work happening on pulling together a synthesis of management activities and the population status. Steve Lepan is working on that right now. That's going to inform a New York management plan around Asakids. There's continued partnership with the Thousand Islands Biological Station, which means we have access to leading experts on these species to help contribute to the sustainability of that population through time. So I highlighted various groups that are within this Asakid working group, trying to sort of combine resources and coordinate to help out. So in summary, there's a lot of regulatory and policy management review pieces. I touched on smallmouth bass, walleye, and northern pike, but sockets in general. There's a lot going on from the management side of things. There's a lot going on the science and research side, and collaboration throughout the St. Lawrence has been a huge part of that. The smallmouth bass fishery is productive and active. Populations are stable or increasing, and condition has increased for those species. Walleye populations also stable or increasing. Things are looking good for walleye as well, but we're having some challenges on some other species like northern pike. One of the big things that I've been very appreciative of is the unprecedented level of collaboration that's been occurring throughout the St. Lawrence River. We're really leaning on each other and our expertise to resolve a lot of these challenges, and it's been great. We have a focus on habitat moving forward. I mentioned that for walleye, but we know that that's a critical point for a lot of these species. I think that's, oh, yep. As I mentioned, QR codes to our annual reports. So both DEC and MNR have annual reports that review more information. I only covered 3 species. There's a whole fish community out there. All of that extra information will be covered in these annual reports. If you scan the QR codes, you can get access to them. And I'm done. So questions?